In this video, I want to honor you as a man. And the first thing that I want to honor is how very uncomfortable this honoring will be for many American men. And I'd like to begin to unpack the poison that we are each given as men at birth and in a series of waves throughout life that make this particularly so. And for the first wave of that poison, I want you to join me in a schoolyard where the envy, the resentment, the hostility and the hate in one group of boys, could be a group of girls as well, but in this case a group of boys, is crystallizing, and it is looking for a target. And the target the individual or the group of boys choose is the most uncertain, the most vulnerable, the most sensitive, the most feminine boy or child in the group, often a little smaller, sometimes a little bit different, often in emotional distress. And within the constellation of the group, it is the persona, the face of the boy, the face of the man, that is the most sociopathic, the most filled with hate, the most angry and calculating. That's part of the sociopathic principle, to dissociate from, and then from a non-empathic place, to calculate what will cause the most harm in that boy. And in the process of doing that, the most feminine boy in the most emotional need is selected as the target. And the purpose of this ritual is to externalize the betrayal, the chauvinism, the attack without mercy, and the banishment of the feminine self within the boy's psyche. Invariably, bullies, people that lift the most weights, people that are most intent to communicate, I don't need anything, I don't want anything, I take what I want, I don't care what anyone else thinks. The feminine self within these men and boys has been decimated, usually by the father, but perhaps by other bullies. Often there is sexual abuse involved. The sexual violation of the feminine side in men and in young boys. In one study, if you watch Mea Culpa Maxima, there's an interesting corollary between the young men and boys who were sexually molested by Catholic priests using the same protocol. They targeted deaf men away from, in boarding schools. So people at their most vulnerable with the least ability to speak were targeted by priests who wanted to give their shame, their helplessness, their terror to these young boys. And so you watched this ritual. You may have participated in it as either a bully, someone who took pleasure, as a witness who participated in the silence of not standing up for the feminine, as someone who goaded on the masculine. You may have participated in aligning yourself with the bully, studiously masking the feelings that you felt if you were at all in touch with your feminine side, for the terror, for the helplessness, for the shame, for the humiliation, for the rage, for the despair, for the grief, and in time, the hostility and hatred of the abuse survivor. You may have dissociated from that and allied yourself with the abuser by feigning indifference. You may have been the abuser, mercilessly targeting the most vulnerable points of the most vulnerable person. You may have been the abused, observing the collusion of the culture in the ritual banishment, in the ritual ejection, in the ritual hostility and hatred towards the feminine in men and in women. Because the sensitivity, the emotionality, the vulnerability is not gender specific. Both sexes have access to the full circle of the psyche. And while the hormones in women predispose by a small margin the feminine predominance, and while the culture and its stereotypes amplifies in at least older traditional cultures the feminine and the masculine stereotype, every human being is born acutely sympathetic, acutely empathic, and every single human being is born in a context of need. As monkeys in packs, as gazelles, as mammals, etc., in packs, we understand that our survival depends on being included in the circle of the tribe, and that to be cast out, what does it mean to be cast out? It means to be on the outside, without a single advocate protecting your safety and pulling you into the circle. To be an outcast. In certain Aboriginal tribes, the shame and the trauma of being disowned is so refined as a ritual that they did not require a physical execution. For a tribal member that stepped over the boundary, every cult, every culture is defined by its norms, which have boundaries. And when an individual steps outside of the boundary, in certain Aboriginal tribes, they are ritualistically disowned. No one acknowledges their presence, their feminine presence. No one speaks to them as if they were there. If they are mentioned in the past. The eyes are averted. They are unwanted. And the psyche of the tribal individual is so interconnected with the circle that the simple psychological act of disowning, that the intention of the tribe that they no longer exist and are no longer welcome, literally kills the spirit of these individuals, who very quickly curl up into a fetal position and submit and surrender. Feminine acts, submission and surrender to the will of the tribe that they die. This is a very powerful form of magic. The collusion of the group to let the feminine persona know inside every man that she is not welcome, that she is hated, that she is a source of shame and embarrassment, that she is inadequate, that she is blamed and cursed with the responsibility for all of the problems of the men. They would not have been bullied if they hadn't had feelings. They would not have been bullied if they hadn't been so weak. They would not have been teased if they hadn't been stupid. They would not have been attacked and abandoned if they had not had needs. You would not have been attacked and abandoned if you did not have needs. And what Maslow says is that these needs exist in a hierarchy. Survival, physical, security, food, water, sex, air, warmth, survival, security in that survival. Certainty, the certainty of survival, not just a fickle, let the boy live today, but a sense of safety. Love and belonging. Belonging somewhere and being welcome. And this dictates so much of the sociopathic behavior in sociopathic environments in school, where the most effeminate boy is being ritually tormented, shamed, and ejected from the circle of tough men who do not need the feminine. The desire to belong, the desire to survive and feel safe in that desire, leads many young boys in the mid-range between their masculine and feminine energies to disavow their feminine in order to belong to the cult of male chauvinism, that the coolest girls, notice that term, on the sociopathic empathic continuum, cool is dissociative. And it is the essence of cool for a young boy to show zero emotional affect, zero impact of the feminine. You are considered cool. If some bully can come up and rage and you have a witty and cutting remark that pulls that bully down to size, trips the bully up with some maneuver, and everyone laughs at the bully. Now you are cool because you showed no emotion. You were not afraid. So, in sociopathic environments, the cold points in the spectrum between sociopathic and empathic are deified by the terrified children who do not want to be shamed and humiliated, tormented and abused and violated and abandoned by all to that treatment. In a context of needing love and belonging. This is not, a need is not negotiable. The need for survival, security, and belonging is essential. And if in order to belong, one must turn one's back on one's own psyche, disowning the feminine, brutalizing her to prove in every gang there is a ritual of acceptance. And in every gang of boys, the ritual involves the murder of the feminine soul. When does the gang fully trust a gang member? When the gang member will ritually sacrifice the deepest expression of their own feminine psyche in service of the gang ethic. There's often a dialogue in the initiatory process of the gang, where the gang leader, who is always the leader on the basis of being the most sociopathic, the most willing to take out a gun and shoot his own best friend if necessary. And that is what makes him respected in a cult that aspires to dissociate from one's own femininity in order not to feel the inevitable pain and helplessness that has already been accepted as part of belonging to a sociopathic culture. It is the most ruthless, the most calculating, the most violent. It is the individual in the gang who is primarily functioning from their reptilian brain that is respected as the gang leader. And this leader can sniff empathy. And so the ritual of someone who needs the gang because they're trying to meet their need to be loved and belong, something that a sociopath is incapable of providing. So you have people on the margins wanting to be part of the gang, part of the in-crowd. And you have the leadership of the gang questioning, are you going to let us down and honor your own feminine soul? Or are you going to complete the ritual of this gang, the ritual betrayal of the feminine? And in many cases, the test of initiation is for the new initiate to betray the person or people or situations that they feel the greatest affection for. So in classic gang literature, etc., the new initiate might be asked to murder his mother, or murder his sister, or rob his parents, or rob his wherever the soft spot is that remains in the human being, it is ritually betrayed and murdered to prove loyalty to the chauvinistic and sociopathic ethic that is deified in a sociopathic context, that is established by the betrayal and the disowning of the felt experience of the infant and the child by the parents, the school, the government, and all surrounding power structures, including in sibling hierarchy, the elder brothers and sisters. In this context, feminine energy is weak, shameful, dangerous. It threatens your needs to survive, feel secure, and belong to your clique. Whatever strata of sociopathic malehood is your comfort zone. Some stratas and some cults within the male bonding allow a pat on the back of a certain amount of violence. Some allow a certain amount of warmth as long as you're drunk. Some allow tenderness and empathy up to a point, or in certain contexts, very specialized contexts. Some, to show any need at all, is to be dangerous and disowned. Many male cliques are ready to disavow any form of femininity that emerges in the man. And this is understood. And in a much lighter vein of betraying the feminine, many of the conflicts in couples occur when the vulnerability of the heart involved in deep love and partnership is ritualistically sacrificed and betrayed on the altar of chauvinistic humor in male circles. And when the lover and the woman arrives in the circle, the boy needing affection from the other boys. These are not men. They are needy boys. Sacrifice the dignity of their love and the dignity of their partner in front of other men to demonstrate that they are not effeminate, to demonstrate that they don't care about the feminine. And then they go home and do an about face as the angry girlfriend leaves them or whatever, and they're in a desperate state because now they need the belonging that is only available with their partner. But she wants nothing to do with someone who would talk about something so precious like that. And now he has a new frenzy, how to keep the belonging of his partner by convincing her that she does matter, and how to keep the belonging of his peers by convincing them that his partner and his feelings do not matter. And so this is the first toxicity given to every man. Now, far from being the sociopathic alligators that the most abused children forming aggressive leadership protocols and sociopathic protocols perpetrate and inoculate into peer and school and different gym environments, men are in some ways more vulnerable than women by the very nature of coming through a womb, of not knowing the transcendent experience of giving birth, and by the fact that the point is always more brittle and fragile than the circle. Within geometry, it is the point that is masculine. It is the circle. In much of the older mythology of our species, goddess created God to share power, to share the space with, so that they could do it together. And the power of the feminine within physics, space is the feminine, and the particle is the masculine. This is why in a chauvinistic masculine culture we talk about we emphasize talking. If you take a Toastmasters course, it will not teach you the art of public listening. It will teach you the art of public speaking, a masculine activity. And yet, it is the space that is feminine, the vastness of space, which, whether it's expressed in its smallest form, the space between a nucleus and an electron within an atom, the amount of space, 99% of all that is in matter is space. And just 1% is the masculine. It's just moving very fast. And it is this sense of smallness in the void of silence, in the void of presence, that is so overwhelming for a culture, for a consciousness that is systematically and unscientifically masculine. We are living in a masculine age where women are asked to demonstrate their masculinity and compete on the basis of their masculinity to outperform men on the basis of masculine traits in a world created to honor the masculine significantly more than the feminine. If we break down the rhythms, the attention, the focus of Western culture, it is predominantly masculine. And the metrics of measuring value measure the masculine traits more than the feminine. People will rate the speaker, but they will not rate the listener. People will rate the teacher more than the student. People will value the leader more than they value the follower. They will value the quality of leadership more than the quality of attunement and response. The masculine is deified. Now, in this context, femininity is shamed. Spending this much time to honor your emotion, to honor my experience, is something taboo, which is why it is hard to be present in a chauvinistic culture for this honoring. One of the reasons that it is essential to honor the feminine in you is the following. Chemistry flows in the balanced polarity, in the multidimensional expression of masculine and feminine poles coming together. This is not gender specific. What I'm talking about is if someone is speaking, is someone else listening? If there is a flow. There is an exchange with someone speaking and someone listening, and hopefully it goes back and forth. Within the flow of touch, if someone is giving touch, is someone present to exquisitely receive that touch? This is the dimension of touch. It is again masculine and feminine pole. In any moment, someone is predominantly giving and someone is predominantly receiving. Someone is opening and someone is initiating. Someone is saying, hey, how about this? And someone else is saying yes. And it is that which creates the flow. And the more dimensions that are involved, if someone initiates scent, and someone savors and opens to the scent, if someone initiates taste and someone savors and opens to the taste, if someone initiates touch and someone opens to the touch, if someone initiates an idea and someone lets that idea change them, in honoring you, I am inviting you into your feminine, which is a dangerous place to be in a sociopathic environment. It's an uncomfortable place to be, because most of your pain happened in that terrain, not because there was anything wrong with you, but because you were systematically and ritually abused, tormented, and humiliated, and then abandoned in that state, in your feminine personas, in your feminine state. I want to let my feminine grieve the deep sadness that she has lived her entire life watching this man betray himself over and over and over again to meet the needs of security, survival, and belonging. The sadness of being completely invisible. The stereotype that is woven around this interaction denies the soul of a man. The soul of a man is his feminine. And if anything, men are more sensitive in the feminine terrain than women. Because women, as a general rule, feminine women, as a general rule, are less afraid of boundary dissolving states. They're less afraid of transcendence. They're less afraid of becoming one with something bigger than themselves. Because the menstrual cycle, because the experience of giving birth, because the feminine presence that predominates to a slight degree in the hormones and in some cases in culture, is the circle. And the circle is powerful and strong enough to surrender. Powerful and strong enough to adapt and respond. A terrified and insecure man such as myself finds pockets of incredible inflexibility because my sense of identity is so brittle relative to many of the people that I engage with, that were I to give this up, let this go, adapt, there's a part of me that doesn't know who I am. There's a part of me that is terrified of dissolving again into the horror of the traumatic state, into a transcendence of horror, rather than a transcendence of belonging. And so I can't budge there. And I have to ask women in many cases who are stronger in their sense of self to change the way they do things, because I'm not ready and able to face that level of terror induced by unresolved trauma in an early infantile state, betrayed by parents and culture in this dynamic. It's too overwhelming to deal with the ego dissolution that is part of transcendence, that is part of flexibility, which is why you will have men be involved in these standoffs much more than women. Looking objectively, they are absurd in many cases. And yet, it is not absurd to the man, because the man's identity, and with it his worth, is on the line, literally on the line, is defined by the line. Meaning in that man's conscious felt experience, if they are pushed past this line and can't fight back, they literally do not exist. They literally lose value, lose meaning, lose definition. And in doing so, enter a chaos that brings many men back to the trauma of childhood, in which they felt completely worthless, completely helpless. And I want to talk about this wave, or this wave pattern, where wave upon wave of abuse is leveled at and crashes over the boy and then the man. So the first wave of profound need that every single child feels is expressed by the desperation, the helplessness, the wailing, the crying of need. And the preparation for the murder of the soul within the culture begins here, as men are segregated, as boys are segregated from girls psychologically. And the men and their feminine side are systematically ignored, with the idea that it is for your own good. That if we do not toughen you up, the soul murdering ritual within the chauvinism of the culture will more brutally toughen the child. And the shame that a father often feels in a patriarchal culture when his son is chosen as the point, as the recipient for the hate and the hostility, when his son is singled out as the most effeminate person in the group and is therefore targeted with the highest concentration of hate, rage, hostility, humiliation. The father, to the degree that he empathically connects with the son, feels the shame that he learned, the shame of being feminine. So there is a dissociation. Now, there was a time in the not too distant past, there are times in cultures around the world today where boys are almost never put down, where their hearts beat in sync with their mother, or they are raised with a mother's milk, where the songs and the dance of the tribe teach a child regulation skills where a child learns mastery of their own inner state, feeding off the strengths and the rhythms of the parent, and where they set the pace of their detachment from the parent and have a secure, healthy connection in which they have certainty about their value, about their survival, and about being wanted, and about belonging to those parents, where they are welcomed and honored with the attention, with the sacrifice that makes them feel sacred, and grow up in communities where the felt experience and the invisible world is honored as deeply as the external and material world, where the emotional self and the feminine psyche are blessed, are honored, are processed and digested as much as the mental thoughts and concepts detached from feeling are processed in Western culture. And these boys know their value. They know the value of their own femininity, because their feminine self, their emotions, their honor, their dignity, has been protected and served by the parents and then the cult. And then the education system is one of mentoring and attunement and giving a new initiated man a sense of belonging and meaning in service to the feminine, in the protection of the women and children from the masculine energy outside the tribe. And so men grow up honoring their own femininity and protecting the women and children in their circle with the same grace and dignity as their own femininity was protected inside of them. In our culture, there is a staccato rhythm of time, a staccato rhythm of adrenaline and cortisol that shatters the bond, creating regular dissociated states between the human and emotional portions of the brain and the fight, flight, freeze, reaction portion of the brain, necessary when an entire culture starts raising children with front doors 30 feet from the street, with technological vehicles that drive by at 40 to 80 miles an hour, with gunfires blaring from 3 or 4 different TVs, with flashing lights, with a stimulation overload that is unprecedented in the species' history. These children are flooded with a complexity of information, of fear, and of legitimate life-threatening things, from electricity to cars to a pill that seems to be medicine if you take one but kills you if you take 3, something that works for the parent but not the child, something that if you pour it into a car engine makes you drive, but if you drink it, it kills you, into a complexity of toxicity and trauma. Trauma is the experience on the part of the individual that their life may be or is in jeopardy. The speed of growth and evolution is shocking for an infant. The complexity of and nuance of the world is traumatizing. When you feel absolutely nothing to feeling 240 volts, and it's just a 2 millimeter movement to the finger. When you've got jets, lighters, or cars where you push this one lever and they flare off into the environment at 80 miles an hour. It's a system that is very, very, very difficult for a child to attune to and stay emotional and stay connected with their feminine. Now, to this burden of regular injections of adrenaline and cortisol that are bringing the child back to the reptilian state, where the fight, flight, freeze instinct of survival, socially and otherwise, is keeping them alive in a hostile environment because there is no circle encompassing the tribe. Because we're back to crocodile days of the individual, out for the individual, out for the individual, whether in a relationship or with other children, etc. And that the collaboration is calculated as opposed to deeply and heartfelt, based on tribal loyalty to the circle, to the feminine. When the ritual of pornography is another version of the evisceration of the feminine. You feel humiliated because she rejected you. You feel uncertain and lack confidence. You feel terrified of the hostility of the sociopathic glare of a woman who looks you over from her masculine side and says, "You worthless piece of shit. You don't make enough money. You don't look good enough. I can't use you. What the fuck do I need with you?" And that is toxicity directly to the man's feminine. And the soul crushing devastation of that helplessness. Or even worse, the not even noticing. Yeah, I'm too busy to acknowledge your interest. I'm too busy to acknowledge your need. I enjoy making you and men feel like shit. You want to play with me and my body? Let's see how shitty I can make you feel. How much will you beg? The amount of hostility that the wounded feminine directs through the masculine towards the sensitive feminine in men is enormous. And the wound can flip so gracefully, so secretively, from feeling helpless and hurt and devastated to feeling and identifying with the aggressor, to flip from the hurt feminine in the man to the aggressive hostility through fantasy. You make me feel like shit? Fine. I'll watch 300 women tonight being treated like whores in the most denigrating way possible. And I'll tell myself that you're just like them. That's my revenge against the shattering, soul-wrenching hit of the hostile masculine in women. In the women who have already learned that their feminine side is absolutely worthless and is worth less than nothing in this culture. And that they are going to be measured solely on masculine traits. And having been dehumanized and turned into dissociated masculine expressions of women who just happen to have breasts and pussies. They lay into the feminine side in man as harshly as they have learned to lay into the feminine side in themselves. And it is you, the most sensitive and vulnerable part in the male psyche, that is targeted for that hatred and the message of the disease. You are worthless. And as with the gangs, if you want to mean something to me, let's see how you can perform. I'll give you a few minutes of my time. See if you can make me laugh. Okay, fine. See how you kiss. Okay, reasonable. What's your bank account? What do you drive? How do you look? What do you smell? Well, I'll give you a few shots. As long as you move me along in the masculine metrics of this culture, yeah, I'll give you a few fucks. If I get bored, I'll go on to someone else. I now know how to demasculate and dehumanize you as efficiently as has been done to women for hundreds of years in a sociopathic masculine culture. And men with a more fragile ego, back to that sense, the feminine is a stronger container. It is the container. The feminine is the space in which the wound occurs. The masculine is the action of the wound. It's a bigger container. It's not only a bigger container, it's a bigger container in a world that does not teach container building. And yet, the body of a woman is more chemically predisposed to feel that, to sense the strength, the part that cannot be broken, the part that can always respond. You see, the masculine can be broken. The tree can be snapped. But the space in which the tree is snapped exists, with a tree intact or with a broken tree. The space in which the event occurs is largely unaffected by the event. It predates the event and it will last soon after. The feminine is, in many ways, the original thing, the womb, out of which the form is born. And women often intuitively and through their bodies have a stronger sense of that. Which means that when a man develops a fantasy of what it would be like to be with some woman, there is an identity that is parallel and developed in part and in pair with the fantasy. Oh, I wish I could be like this and do this and do this, and I imagine myself like this, and I imagine myself being able to, being in this sport field like this, and then they're not picked for the team. And it's not just the rejection or the humiliation of not being chosen. It's the shattered identity. It's like, well, who am I? Who am I? How do I exist in my own consciousness in which the feminine has been so submerged to avoid the shame and hostility that is directed at the feminine in men even more than in women? How do I experience my own existence? It's as if I do not exist, and any person can snuff me out simply by leaving me. When the insecurity of identity is so much stronger in men than it is in women. because the masculine is more fragile. It's like the masculine is the glass chalice. The feminine is the water. The chalice can break. The water never breaks. It just changes from one moment to the next, depending on the shape it is in. You do not destroy or create water, but you shatter a glass. The child that is born into shock and dissociation, that cannot process the level of grief, the level of terror, the level of dissociation going on in this interface with the modern world, but has highly masculinized men and women managing the child's physical state with little or no attunement to the feminine and the felt emotional state of the child, with little attunement or awareness of the fact that when the parent feels enormous rage and repressed hostility and hatred and stress, that the child attunes to that and knows itself for the first time in those emotional states, unable to distinguish itself in the reality that every child is initially in a deeply feminine and thus deeply receptive state, men and women, girls and boys, comes to know itself, comes to consciousness in a state of resentment, fear, stress, anger, repressed hatred, all the tensions going on in the different battles of sexes and betrayals and energies of this and agendas going on. And there is no room for love. Love is the service, the willing service of an individual to use their energy, their support, to first ensure the survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem of the child, and position them in a way where they can start to experience self-actualization, not the actualization of the cultural dogmas, of the religious dogmas, of the scientific dogmas, but of the self, the felt self in a balance of masculine and feminine energy, of play and spontaneity and empathy and joy and exploration and creativity. As an interesting aside, 98% of children entering the education system do so highly creative and alive, and only 2% manage to retain that vitality and creativity as they come out the other side. The masculinization of the school process, not only with the bullying and the social protocol in which girls and boys, particularly the popular one, participate in a sociopathic spatting match in which the people who end up on top are the most sociopathic and prefer to mate with people with similar sociopathic standing. And when the parenting program transitions into the education program and the boob tube, hyperadrenaline, hypercortisol, hyperdissociative, hypermasculine, hyper-objectifying, in which there is shame and shame and shame and criticism, and the child naturally defaults to what is a culture of perfectionism, that the absolute agony and loneliness that young boys feel, that their felt emotional needs, their desperation, their need to belong, their need to exist, their need to grow, their need to be liked, their need to be popular, the whole social need to love and belong is predicated on their capacity to suppress and betray the feminine and express this cool, sociopathic persona necessary to survive in a cult ritual dynamic that is deeply and profoundly sociopathic, which is further emphasized by the metrics of value in the commercial world. The commercial world is itself a masculine competition. Capitalism, the goal of turning $1 into $2, the capitalistic system, a paradigm in which rules are set that supposedly are a little bit equal, that will allow people to compete to turn dollars into more dollars and to turn time into more dollars, is a system that measures masculine variables: output, results, efficiency, productivity, the creation of products, the delivery of a service. And while the feminine is honored, you can see the chauvinism at play in a little story with a Bangkok hotel I had recently, in which the grief welling up and coming through me was so intense that I couldn't process it. And being a man and told that I do not have feelings and that I'm not emotional and that I don't have needs and all of the many messages that are told to men, it's inconceivable that a man could be in this amount of grief. The grief starts welling through my body at such an intensity that at some point my body takes over and does what it has done my entire life. The emotional pain transmutes into physical pain, which is culturally acceptable and which is not overwhelming to my male psyche. And so now I have excruciating physical pain. So excruciating I can't sleep, etc. And I begin a very slow protocol of tending to my body in lieu of being able to tend to my emotions, because one of the deepest violations in our culture is that you and I as a man will not receive a single hour of emotional literacy in a single class in kindergarten, middle school, or high school. And what we will receive are thousands of shaming messages based on emotional illiteracy. If you are Christian and you are read the Ten Commandments, you are exposed to the first wave of emotional illiteracy. Because the science of emotion and the science of the feminine is that it is responsive. Emotions are like water. If you take the water and pour it into a cylindrical environment, it takes the shape of a cylinder. If you pour it into a triangular environment, it takes the form of a triangle. If you form it into an amoeba shape, it becomes an amoeba. This is the responsive nature of emotion. And psychologists and good psychotherapists understand that you cannot command someone to hate or not to hate if that is the spontaneous feminine message, meaning that if this and this and this is done to them, that the experience of hate will be induced predictably. For example, if you bring extraordinary shame coupled with extraordinary terror, coupled with extraordinary helplessness, and there is a willful intent to induce this state and zero help to get out of it, this will induce the state of rage, hate, and despair. It's just common sense. It's like a chemistry set. But you and I are not going to learn that in a single school. And instead, we're going to learn that we are commanded to feel love for parents that often abuse and destroy our soul, which is a scientific anomaly. It's nothing new for the churches to be out of sync with data, but it is a source of shame, and it is a source of new trauma to the extent that the churches believe, because there is a deep shame among our children, among you and I, for the hatred and the rage and the hostility we feel for the authority figures, parental, teacher, peers, or others, that humiliate, set us up to fail, induce states of deep need and desperation, induce phenomena in environments in which we are helpless. A lot of bullying, for example, takes place, in which you have 3 or 4 of the strongest bodies in a school ganging up on the least competent, the least physically assertive, the most feminine, the least able to protect oneself. And a lot of it is the psychological warfare of inducing intense hostility, inducing helplessness. And the bullying will sometimes stop when the bully can see in the eyes of their victim the level of hatred, the level of hostility, the level of hurt, and the level of cold numbness that they, the bully, themselves have achieved, thus contracting the disease with their victim. So they already have the disease as a bully. It's not normal to torment another human being. One has to first dissociate from one's feminine, which is not normal in a social, healthy environment. It is normal in a sociopathic culture, such as our own. So first, the bully has to be hurt repeatedly without help and without remorse into a sociopathic state, where the only way they can process the pain is to completely dissociate from their feminine. The feminine that begins to rise up through their psyche, again, in a state of absolute agony and abject despair and helplessness, is something they learn to hate, identifying with their abuser. And they learn to get it down and attack their own feminine preemptively. The trouble with an effeminate boy in the environment is we are sympathetic human beings. We have mirror neurons that help us bond with whoever we're with. And when we try and make sense of the most feminine, helpless, and vulnerable boy in the school, the only part of us that knows how to deal with that part is the depressed, repressed, enraged, and terrified feminine suppressed in the bully's psyche. And it begins to rise up to create connection with the terror in the sensitive boy. And this rising up induces states of terror, overwhelm, fear of punishment, fear of further abuse, etc., in the psyche of the bully. And so they attack the sensitive representation of their own soul in the other boy. And through the ritual process of betraying him, further damage their own feminine psyche and demonstrate to themselves that they are capable of enough dissociation that they're not overwhelmed and turned into the helpless grief and despair that is the healthy feminine in a sociopathic environment. The healthy feminine does feel grief and does feel enormous despair and expresses it in body, heart, and mind, and in a healthy culture that is loved, attuned to, understood, and honored. In a dissociative culture such as our own, it is distanced. When I communicated from that place to everyone within the community that I needed help. This was the moment of hostility and abandonment coming towards me. Because every single man and woman in this community knows what it's like to feel that way. And they know how overwhelming those feelings are. And they know how hard it is to cope in a sociopathic environment, to put on a mask and go to work, etc., when you're dealing with that. And so, as efficiently and effectively as that part of each member of the community is disowned, when that face arrives on the outside, it is poised to be murdered in a variety of ways, the most efficient being silence and invisibility. When you cover someone with projection, you block and void the meaning, the significance of that which is covered over. It's like taking the beauty of the Mona Lisa, and I don't want to feel poignant, I don't want to sense it, so I'm just going to cover it with wallpaper. And now I feel absolutely nothing. And I say, well, there's nothing to feel anything about. Well, there is if you take the wallpaper. No, that doesn't exist. It's all just wallpaper. It's all just materialism. There's nothing there. Oh, it's so boring. And that's why I'm unpacking these wounds, in order to honor you, in order to see you, in order to support you in empathizing with what it's like for the feminine half of who you are to grow up in this world. Because there are many, many consequences to this protocol. A protocol in which there is massive levels of physical, sometimes sexual, and emotional abuse in a majority of our households. When you are physically beaten, when your ear is pulled, when you are publicly humiliated, the fragility of a young boy's ego is often hurt so deeply, if they are present with who they are, that the shame of doing one's best and being in this feminine state and being mocked and hated is so intense that it will drive the child, it will drive you to a despair of self-harm, to identify with the abuser because it feels so overwhelmingly powerless, to identify with the helplessness of being this hurt and this needy in an environment in which your hurt and your need, induced by the environment, meaning it's not coming out of nowhere. The feminine is always in response to the environment. The feminine always speaks the truth. If you want to know the shape of the glass, look at the shape the water is in. If you want to know about the health of the environment, look at the health of the emotions and the people in that environment. If you have children filled with hate, if you have children filled with helplessness, if you have children filled with numb self-loathing, if you have children killing themselves with apathy and addiction, you have children existing in an environment of immense toxic hostility towards their feminine side, thus shaping a container in which your feminine self wants to kill herself, doesn't want to eat, doesn't want to, or wants to attack. And the most sophisticated healers and doctors do not diagnose the child. They diagnose the family through the child. The most sophisticated healers, shamans, and therapists will look at the presenting symptoms of the black sheep in the family system. This is the child who has agreed to embody all of the shit no one else in the family wants to deal with. And the effective healer and doctor will diagnose exactly what's wrong with everyone else by looking at exactly what expressions are going on inside the black sheep. The black sheep is just the one who has, in the family contract of abuse, agreed to carry the shadow of the culture. See, the family agrees to carry the shadow of the culture by not protesting the absurdity of the cultural norms. A family prepares their child for slaughter at school rather than preparing the school to nurture a soul into full expression. A family prepares a teen for slaughter at work rather than preparing a job that honors the dignity of a human being. And a culture prepares children for slaughter at home rather than educating the parents on the shadow and the abuse cycles within the culture that have been going on for generations, that have a statistical ratio of murder, insanity, PTSD, depression, and other forms of abuse as contagious diseases. You want to know what's statistically going to give your child or any child PTSD? Just give them to two parents who have PTSD. There's more than 89% chance that that child will grow up with severe trauma in a state they can't manage it in a culture that doesn't honor it, called PTSD. But a culture prepares its child for slaughter in the hands of such parents rather than preparing the parents to receive the potential that you are. We're going to take a little break and come back. Resuming now, I want to talk a little bit about metta. The reason for this conversation, the reason for this honoring. There's a way that I've spent my entire life as a man pursuing certain ideals and challenging myself to grow, learn, explore, experiment in search of those ideals, and have been far more fortunate than the vast majority of people in terms of access to money, access to travel, access to personal growth opportunities, and yet I've failed in 80% of cases to realize more than about 40% of what I've set out to do, despite achieving thousands of goals and despite having a lot of material success. I've failed in the nurturing of my own feminine self. I've failed in the healing of my own feminine self. And as a result, I've watched the abuses towards my feminine by my parents, by my grandparents, both directly to me but also through my parents. The abuses of the grandparents become the abuses of the parents, become the abuses of the grandchildren, in a cult that refuses to own its responsibility to teach the most basic emotional literacy to its people, generation after generation. And much like the flu, much like the AIDS epidemic, it is scientific probability fact that diseased individual, be those mental, emotional, or physical diseases, are contagious through the mirror neurons, through empathy and impact. And so what is unhealed in the grandparents becomes the diseases of the child. What is unhealed in that adult child becomes the diseases of the grandchild. And what is unhealed in the adult child and in the child becomes the diseases passed on to peers. I also feel very fortunate to have a sense of who I am outside of the disease, outside of the cultural protocol and the culturally cultivated mask, which is a diseased mask. The norms of our culture are barbaric by the standards of the soul. And the fact that most of us do not see or feel the impact of that cruelty does not speak to the vast advancements in soul, feminine, and emotional literacy, but rather to the dissociated numbness that we have as a culture towards our own soul, towards our feminine, in both men and women. I feel for you because as a probability field, I know what you have gone through, will go through, and are going through on a daily basis for your feminine self to exist at all, for you to want her to be conscious, your sensitivity, your responsiveness, your capacity to listen to soul and spirit, your capacity to transmute and transcend the cultural diseases that are permeating our social ecosphere and rippling out through the paradigms of capitalism, the paradigms of consumerism, into the degradation of our external feminine, our environment, our ecology. I feel very fortunate to have grown up in kind of the higher edge of the capitalist paradigm. My father was an offshore currency hedge fund manager. He is now dead. Owner of a gold mine, builder of passive solar homes, director of nonprofit organizations, and philosopher, and kind of set an example for me that since I left home with $50 at age 17, I have been able to self-generate and achieve more goals and money than I certainly set out to, and plenty to live in a lifestyle that after buying just about anything and everything that I could really want, I mean, I don't want a Ferrari, I don't want endless houses, you know, there's a lot that I understand the burden of owning things. But the real depression of our culture hit me at the point when survival and pleasure could no longer justify the need to expand material goals. And that's all I knew how to do in this culture. And when I was striving to be debt-free, striving to have savings, striving to build my first house, striving to achieve this goal and that goal, striving to learn this skill and that skill, whether it was welding or operating heavy machinery or building roads or whatever the skill was, when I was striving, particularly in the first 15 years of my career, there was always something important to engage my consciousness in keeping busy, as is our cultural mantra. But at a certain point, one knows more than one can possibly justify knowing. One has done more than needs to be done. One has more than one needs. And the fallacy of the paradigm that if you just make enough money and produce enough things and do enough things, that you will be happy and the paradigm and the game is won, emerges into focus. And it becomes very clear why many billionaires are more depressed than 20-somethings who are working menial jobs but have a dream that all they have to do is follow the cultural script. It's not true. And you don't realize, at least I didn't realize, that the paradigm of materialism and capitalism was as hollow as it is until I looked at the fact, because my big goal, starting in my teens, was to prepare for a partner. And I wanted to get to a point where money was not the determining factor in where I lived, in who I dated, and where the relationship could grow in a healthy way based on the unique properties in the woman I loved and myself, with no other constraints. That was my big goal. And in my 30s, in my late 20s actually, I began hitting that goal, only to find that there was no woman that I met who was actively preparing her life for the same ambition. Meaning I've never met a woman who said, oh yes, I've been working since my teens to get my outer logistics together so that I can be an equal partner in a relationship where what is the exquisite soulful journey of both people determines the flow and time and rhythm of the relationship, and money is peripheral. Money is in service to the relationship. I've talked with over 5,000 women, and I have not met the woman who has prepared logistically, practically, psychologically with the dream of being an equal partner in a sacred relationship. And that is heartbreaking. I have not met the woman who has prepared herself psychologically to be an optimal partner in a conscious relationship. In the most basic ways, I have asked, it's probably somewhere in between 200 and 400 times. That's pretty safe window, since most of the, it's not like I take notes on these things, but somewhere between 200 and 400 times I have asked individuals, primarily women, but also men, what would I have to do to help you feel and help you think that you were totally and completely loved by me or by anyone? And there has never been an individual that had an answer ready. And the question is, given the amount of lip service that is paid to love as the ultimate thing and what you want to have done on your deathbed, the question is, how probable is it that an individual will succeed at making another individual feel completely loved, completely and totally loved, on a mental, emotional, physical level, if the person does not know what that looks like at all? Meaning, it often takes 5 minutes to extract a single data point in what is a tapestry of literally hundreds of data points. Meaning the touch sensitivity of deep and fulfilling love is a data point. The speed of touch is a data point. The sequence of touch is a data point. The smell in the air is a data point. The sounds, the music is a data point. The tastes are a data point. The topic of conversation, the duration before there is a back and forth in the, is it a back and forth every 10 seconds, every 20 seconds, every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every hour? You see, there's a different rhythm in the switching between speaking and listening that makes the difference between someone feeling honored and respected. I have quite a long rhythm. I love to listen to someone for 1, 2, or 3 hours. It's wonderful. And I love to speak for 1, 2, or 3 hours. It's wonderful. And so for me, the rhythm of speak, even 30 minutes is wonderful. Let's speak 30 minutes. Now let's listen. Speak and listen. This is a data point. And some people have a 5-second switch point. And this must be communicated in the tapestry of feeling and thinking and experiencing a phenomena of security, respect, joy, pleasure, honoring, awakening, that is the algorithm labeled as love. Labeled as love by the person who decides what love is. One person says that this is a creepy behavior. Another person says it is incredibly exciting. Another person says they don't get it, which is why it is up to each individual to know what love is. And here's the sad thing as men. Many of these women tell me, by many I mean more than 90% of these women tell me that not a single human being in their 30, 40, 50, or 60 years on the planet has ever asked them what would make them feel completely and totally loved. And in the absence of anyone asking, it has not seemed particularly relevant to answer the question, to prepare an answer. And this is very sad. It predisposes the population to the level of mediocrity we experience. Because if you dig right down and beyond the political correctness, once you get to know someone, and you can easily penetrate a facade, or at least hit the facade, when you ask someone, how are you feeling? Do you feel loved? They say, oh, I'm feeling great. And you say, well, what's great? Is your boyfriend great? Well, no, he's not really great. Well, is your work great? Well, I'm very tired at work. How highly would you rank your lunch today? Well, it's getting a bit boring, and it's all the same old thing, but it's cheap, and when's the last time you had a peak experience? Well, what's that? And who's your best friend? Can you tell her everything? And someone that doesn't want this facade of everything's great penetrated will just evade and not answer any of these questions. But if you look at every single area of their life, and it's mediocre to exhausting to tiring to boring to miserable to depressing to sad to confusing to overwhelming, you don't take 20 different areas that are doing okay to terrible and add them all up, and suddenly they synergize into a great life. And this is sad, because it's not the fault of the individual. And one of the saddest things about American culture is the protection afforded to the abuser, which begins at a national level, which begins with protecting the status quo, because the culture is the single biggest abuser within the environment. Meaning there's nothing personal about your childhood trauma and abuse. There's nothing personal about you not knowing what is abuse. There's nothing personal about the numbness and dissociation of many childhood memories during which trauma took place and was disowned. There is nothing personal about the disowned, tormented, and traumatized feminine. And there is nothing personal about the violence perpetrated on your feminine psyche that migrates onto the violence, into the violence that you perpetrate against the feminine psyche in the children and people that you love. After first, of course, perpetrating it on oneself. The consensus among psychologists and psychotherapists is that all abuses are initially done to oneself and then externalized to others. Now, the mechanism of this is important to understand, because when you dissociate from your feminine side and associate with the masculine abuser towards the dissociated feminine, the part in you that you are abusing is unconscious, whereas the part in a woman or a child or a sensitive man that you are abusing is conscious. It's also very important to understand that it is inevitable that without healing and consciousness in an environment capable of dealing with trauma, shame, and abuse, which, by the way, is less than 1% of the case in our culture, meaning there is a vast amount. 85% of American men are dealing with deep, unresolved, unhealed trauma, dissociation, complex PTSD, early childhood attachment issues, addictions, which are cover-ups for trauma, compulsions, which are cover-ups for trauma, a work compulsion, a control compulsion, a rage addiction. These are masks and coping mechanisms that we develop, that all human beings develop, when there is trauma that we lack the ability to deal with and heal. All abuse begins within. As an interesting aside that is not looked at, it's very interesting why so many of these patterns are willfully kept out of history books. The Nazis gassed 70,000 non-Jew Germans as part of Hitler's cleansing of the undesirables before the Nazis began to mass murder the Jews. 70,000 children and people with disabilities or elderly, or 70,000 non-Jew Germans were murdered to purify the German race before that protocol was applied to the Jewish people. Had the culture within Germany not been able to digest that internal genocide and view it as something positive, it could not have been externalized. And had the level of childhood abuse and trauma, which is documented in Hitler's generation extensively, not been tolerated and seen as a good thing in a culture that is protecting its own abuse cycle, protecting it and shaming and blaming the child. Alice Miller is the leader in that, which is why I talk about that. This level of brutality would not make sense. The autocratic, totalitarian expression of masculine energy has no spell on a psyche that is not deeply chauvinistic, which is not how a single child is born. It is how we become acculturated as men and women. There is so much that we deal with in pressure and grief as men that is silenced and behind a mask. And I want to lay those silences and those masks down in this time. Because these are not our shadow. They are the shadow of the culture that has been given to us to carry. So, the first shadow is that the feminine psyche in men is brutalized by mothers, fathers, peers, and teachers alike. As boys and men are told systematically that they have no feelings, that if they do, they should be ashamed of them, that their deepest terrors, lonelinesses, and needs have zero impact within the cult, other than to be targets of bullying and shaming. That the deep terrors, vulnerabilities, and needs that the feminine side within every man in this culture experiences at one point or another do not exist, because they are exterminated in the projected stereotype of the sociopathic man. That is, as I have been told, on more than 1,000 occasions, men do not feel that. I tell a woman, a man, someone that I feel this, and I am told, no, you don't. Men do not feel that. In other words, I do not exist as a feminine self within this cult. What exists, and what is far more important, is the chauvinistic stereotype of what men are and men aren't. Less than 2% of the time have I been interested in women primarily for sex. It's probably about 1%. And it's for brief, it's an initial lust wave or something like that. And yet I have been told more than 1,000 times, the vast majority of which are completely erroneous, that I am just interested in sex. Meaning the stereotype and the projection of the sociopathic, manipulative, unemotional man has been formed by men and women and shoved in my face to a point where I have lost arguments or debates about what I am feeling. Not because I lose track of what I'm feeling or fail to communicate it, but because the woman or the man, but primarily it's been women, refuses to give up the projection and see who I am. So the conversation goes something like this. I'm feeling this. Men don't feel that way. Well, I do. No, that's not how men feel. I mean, hello? Am I a man? Do I have a penis? What is going on here? No, that's just, I've never heard anything like that. That's not right. And it's like, do you want to relate to men or do you want to relate to me? I mean, I happen to be a man, but what's going on here? and I'm given a long lecture on what men do and do not do by a woman who thought she was interested in a growth-oriented man who obviously had some attraction to me, or we wouldn't be having the conversation. And I sometimes lose on the basis that I'm not going to hang in there guilty unless I manage to prove innocent, when someone is far more interested in the projection than who I am. I can believe in a cult in which we have been raised without a single hour of emotional literacy. What do I mean by that? There have been cultures, and there could be cultures, in which it would be considered incredibly intelligent. Now, what is intelligence? Have we been given a definition that is intelligent? Do we have an intelligent definition of intelligence? See, I think intelligent could be expressed as an equation that is the efficient transmutation of energy into well-being, and that the organisms, the consciousness that is the most efficient at turning available resources into sustainable expressions of multidimensional well-being is the most intelligent organism in relationship to others that do a less effective job or no job at all, or manage to turn all the energy into toxicity. Now, I have met people with bare high school GEDs, no ambitious, no job qualifications, low social status in our culture, who manage to bring joy and beauty to most of the people into any room they enter. And I consider these people incredibly intelligent, more so than myself. And yet I am told, as a very unhappy man and a very unhappy child in most of my life, that I am very intelligent because I have articulating talent, which does not translate into creating multidimensional well-being with available resources. In many cases, it's the opposite, because in an already left-brain culture emphasizing masculinity, to have a strong masculine trait is unfortunate, because it adds a personal imbalance to the already existing environmental imbalance and cultural imbalance, when the greatest well-being and grace is found in balance. So this is just one more confusing dynamic. There are and have been and could be cultures in which for 1 to 3 hours a day, every individual in the culture would learn about the art of creating human state and human relationships by transmuting negative emotions into positive emotions, by facilitating positive change as a result of constricting emotion as feedback, by facilitating and amplifying positive emotion, and by digesting and creating emotional intimacy, by expressing and sharing feelings, which many tribal cultures do devote in the women's circles and the different rituals of the culture. Many healthy, vibrant cultures spend a third of their time, if you notice the composition of the human being, an intelligent breakdown says that we're 1/3 mind, 1/3 heart, 1/3 body. If you look at our felt experiences as human beings and delete all emotion, all awareness, all motivation, we don't even get out of bed. We don't do anything. We're dead very soon. If you have zero thought, but you're a vegetable who has feelings, there's no identity, there's no consciousness. The most intelligent breakdown, if you could be a vegetable that never had a thought or feeling for the rest of your life, that's choice number one. Or you could be a detached, dissociative mind without any feeling, which means you have no motivation to grow. It is emotion that gives you the motivation to grow. Fears, pleasures, curiosity, these are all emotional filters that engage with the mind to create growth. If you have zero emotion, then you have no meaning, no motivation to think a thought, finish a thought, do anything. You don't have a body anyway. So probably the best possible scenario would be to be frozen in a state of joy or happiness, in unconscious bliss, without any thought and without any body, relative to a meaningless mind that isn't growing, or a vegetable but with no consciousness. Probably what most people would choose would be to feel good and not have a reason to feel good, and not have a body to have to manage to feel good. And yet, despite this obvious fact that a good percentage of people, if they tried it out, okay, you are going to turn you into a vegetable for the next week, and then you can decide to continue that indefinitely, or we're going to shut off all emotion and just have you with zero drive and no instinct or anything, just no sense of fear, pleasure, love, anything, just random thoughts. Let's see how you like that for a week. Or we'll help you create a peak state and then shut down your thoughts and dissociate you from your body. And people have blissful out-of-body experiences. So what I'm getting at is that the feminine is a logical choice as the pinnacle of human experience if you had to divide the self into three parts and pick only one. So it's very fascinating that the feminine is the only part that has zero time devoted to it. It's also fascinating when we understand that every single human motivation comes from our emotional self. It's very fascinating when every scientific breakthrough is motivated by emotion, by curiosity, by feelings, by passion, by lust, by greed, by envy, all the different emotions that evolve into breakthroughs in science, that not a single scientist receives a single formal hour of emotional literacy in their whole scientific career. It's the kind of paradox we get into when, it's the same kind of stupidity of men thinking they're better than the women who gave birth to them, which is kind of a difficult mathematical equation. Like if you take your mother and delete her, you delete yourself as well. So any man that is superior to the mother that gave birth to them, it just doesn't make any sense, except in the framework of cultural chauvinism. It doesn't make mathematical or scientific sense. A scientist might say, well, if you can't have any men without women, maybe women are more important than men. But a culture or a religion will turn right around and ignore the fact that men came out of women, and will shame and denigrate them and pretend that they have no value or much less value, or to be patronized. It's the exact same conundrum of a culture that will deify thinking, innovation, and body, while pretending not to notice the fact that every single thought is fueled by the feminine, is within each person, fueled by the emotion, the feelings of each person.